and welcome. I'm Julia Manchester, national political reporter at The Hill. Thank you for joining us for our program today, Building Consensus Around Environmental Policy. We partnered with the American Conservation Coalition, Brown Girl Green, and the Schwarzenegger Institute to get a read on what both conservative and progressive climate Gen Z activists think is most important when it comes to climate change and the environment. While the Republican base remains opposed to environmental protections and the overwhelming frontrunner in the presidential race, former President Donald Trump, has promised to quote-unquote drill, drill, drill if he's reelected, many young Republicans are looking for conservative policies to address climate change. With that in mind, we're bringing you a series of bipartisan discussions where we talked about everything from environmental justice, nuclear energy, permitting reform, green jobs, climate solutions, and green economy opportunities. We invite you to join in on the conversation. You can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag #TheHillEnvironment. Former Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger joined the climate activists at an off-the-record roundtable to discuss the importance of climate change.
When I go up to Capitol Hill in Washington, and I met with Republican environmentalists. The interesting thing was that some of them didn't believe in climate change. And which I totally understand.
For my first interview, I sat down with Chris Barnard, the president of the American Conservation Coalition, and Christy Drutman, founder of Brown Girl Green and co-founder of the Green Jobs Board. Christy is a speaker, consultant, media producer, and environmental educator, passionate about working at the intersections between media, diversity, and environmentalism. Chris believes that America can win the clean energy arms race and compete with China in the 21st century. Take a listen. So, Christy and Chris, you don't really see a conservative and a liberal or someone who leans to the right, leans to the left, partnering up for an event like this, especially in today's political climate. Talk about why this is so important, particularly for young voters and young activists.
I think we're at a time where the climate crisis is real and we need young people, regardless of your political affiliation or background, to get involved. And I think a lot of young people care about this issue and want to get on board, but don't necessarily know how to navigate that in today's polarized, political climate. Things feel very heated and contentious, and that we're just rubbing up against each other, and that there's not really the ability to have these kinds of critical conversations where we can actually bring in empathy and humanity and talk about this issue that matters the most to us, which is climate change.
Right. And Chris, from your perspective?
Yeah, polling shows 81% of young Republicans under the age of 35 believe climate change is real and they want to do something about it. And to your point, they aren't really part of this conversation. They don't feel heard, whether it's either on the left or by Republicans in Congress, and they care. And so what we do at ACC is we represent those young conservatives to make their voices be heard and to participate in conversations like this, because we firmly believe that we have ideas and solutions to bring to the table, and we want to figure them out. And at the end of the day, this is a nonpartisan issue. Ronald Reagan said, the environment is not liberal or conservative. It's just a common sense issue, and that's the way that we approach it. And that's how we partner together to find common ground on how can conservatives and liberals come together and come up with solutions that actually do something that will solve this problem and also be good for the country.
Now, Republican or conservative and climate change or environmentalism, you don't often hear those words together in the same sentence. Talk about this community of young conservative or young Republican environmentalists and why they're not maybe until now heard as much.
Yeah, well, I would say that it wasn't always this way. If you look back in American history, Teddy Roosevelt, who was a Republican president, founded kind of the modern conservation movement, put over 200 million acres of public land aside to be protected. The first national park, Yellowstone National Park, was first designated to be protected by Ulysses Grant, another Republican. Richard Nixon founded the Environmental Protection Agency. Ronald Reagan signed the Montreal Protocol. There's a really rich legacy and history of Republicans actually working on these issues, and often they worked across the aisle because the ideas were good and to put policy over politics. Sadly, we lost that in the last few decades. Republicans and conservatives took a step back from these conversations, and ACC was founded in 2017 to really build what we call the conservative environmental movement, to go back to our roots, to go back to our legacy, and say, like, look, we care about the outdoors, we care about nature, we care about wildlife, we care about the planet that we live in, and so let's talk about solutions to protect that rather than like be stuck in this partisan rhetoric. And so really we're seeing more and more young people, especially, like I mentioned, 81% of young Republicans believe we need to do something about this. We're seeing a generational shift, and ACC is leading that.
Right. And we hear so much about the language. I mean, the governor himself, Governor Schwarzenegger, said earlier, this word climate and climate change can be triggering to some people, and it honestly has a bit of a partisan connotation. Talk about the difference in language we hear between maybe more left-leaning environmentalists and more conservative environmentalists.
I think a big part of the conversation we had today was that there's new opportunities to be able to talk about environmental issues that can reach people across the political spectrum, and a lot of that we're realizing comes down to things like air and water pollution, protecting the areas and the communities we care about the most, and making that the principle and the value, right? So instead of maybe not using terms like climate change, but focusing on this community aspect, being able to create spaces that we enjoy to live in and to breathe in and to play in, then that's something everyone can agree on regardless of where you're coming from on the issue. And we realize that maybe that's a way, if we talk about health and energy and economic access and ability to get a job, if we're able to bring more of those opportunities to light on the co-benefits of living on a healthier and more stable planet, then people, regardless of where you land on the political spectrum, could get behind that.
And Chris, in talking, we talk about the young conservatives and older conservatives. Do you think there's a language barrier between those two groups within the movement?
Yeah, and I'll start by saying, actually, like everything you just said, there's not a person in America that disagrees with that. And I kind of find it interesting that I feel like even your language has shifted from just doing the roundtable earlier today. And that's really cool to see, because at the end of the day, we care about the solutions, not about the way you talk about it. It's about getting people on board. And that's something that definitely, there is a generational gap. Like, if you were to say climate crisis, like you mentioned earlier, like a lot of older Republicans would be like, whoa, I am not comfortable with that term. But if you then say, like, actually, it's about protecting your backyard. It's about giving access to your kids to live in a healthy environment with clean air and clean water. Like, that's something that everyone can get behind. And I think we need to stop dividing ourselves politically or even generationally and just think about the ways that we can relate to this on a human, personal level. Like, most Americans don't have an understanding of what, like, carbon dioxide is, or like parts per million, or net zero by 2050. That doesn't really mean much to most people. But if you talk about economic opportunity from clean energy, or if you talk about getting rid of pollution that's in the air that you breathe or the water that you drink, if you have beautiful national forests to go hike in, that's what people can understand. And if we can bring it back to that personal level, then we're going to just see a lot more people coming together on this rather than being divided by it.
And I just wanted to say, like, a big part of our conversation was also that a lot of communities have just been left out of this conversation, right? Marginalized communities, Black, Indigenous, people of color, rural communities, people who are living in poverty currently. All of this has been not necessarily prioritized at the level it needs to be when it comes to environmental protections. And we realize that with doing storytelling and bringing people into the conversation, we have to make sure that we are being translators and we're being bridge builders for all sorts of communities, and to recognize where our own biases lay, right? And how we're spreading these messages and communicating this to get people to take action.
And Chrissy, in a lot of your activism and with Brown Girl Green, you've done a lot to uplift voices of color. Talk about how the intersection of environmentalism and communities of color, how communities of color are affected, and how you're working to uplift these communities.
Yeah, due to so many systemic factors that have disenfranchised communities of color all across this nation today, many communities of color are living on the front lines of environmental disasters, environmental pollutants, and proximity to hazards every single day. And for me, I felt like or I believe that many of these communities are not at the forefront of these conversations, aren't given a platform to talk about how their communities have essentially been neglected, have been gaslit, have been convinced that their needs around clean air and clean water are invalid. And a lot of these communities have had to fight tooth and nail to prove the validity of the environmental harms that they have been facing. And for me, I feel like the intersection of these issues is that to bring these communities to the forefront and to make sure that their voices get heard, that has policy implications. So it's not just a matter of, oh, it's nice to have this storytelling. It can be a matter of life and death for a lot of communities. Because if their stories aren't told, then the policies that get implemented aren't necessarily centering their needs front and center, right? And so for me, I figure if I can use my platform to make sure that their voices and their stories are heard, that hopefully it can create these cultural ripples and reach the right people who can potentially influence the right folks in positions of power to really prioritize and take the needs of these communities seriously and provide them with the political resources and economic resources they need to protect their communities.
And Chris, how is ACC working to reach communities, rural communities, communities of color, all of these different communities in the country? How are you guys working to reach them?
Yeah, at the end of the day, we see this as an issue of environmental pollution harms people kind of across the political spectrum. It doesn't really matter if you're a white person or a black person, if you're living near an area that's polluted, that's going to impact you. And the way that we approach that is, at the end of the day, we need to be protecting the environment and having clean air and clean water for everyone. And there's actually opportunity here that when we're talking about tackling pollution, tackling climate issues, it's about reframing this conversation to not be like, oh, we're going to leave some people behind. Some people will just have to learn to code. And like there's like a whole conversation there where we're like trading some communities for other communities. The way that we approach this is every single community in the country and in the world has a stake in a healthy environment. And we need to give them the opportunity to have a seat at the table. Like I talked to coal miners in Utah, and they tell me that their biggest export is young people because they don't have the economic opportunity to be a part of the future. I talked to white working class communities in Appalachia, and they're struggling economically. And so how can those communities also be brought into the conversation? And I think politically that's really where ACC fits a niche where conservatives have the opportunity to broaden this conversation. And it's about all Americans, all communities, and offering the opportunity for any person, including marginalized communities, including poor communities, no matter their race, to have a seat at the table and to see a bright future that we can offer to them.
Oftentimes, I think when lay people and people not in the environmental activism community, when they hear about environmental activism, sort of the first thing they see, in the headlines and such, are these protests. I mean, one big thing has been, protests at these art museums, and it seems like that's garnering the most attention. It's obviously very eye-catching, but I want to hear what you both think about where the activist space can improve, and really, and I think you speak to this a lot, Chris, what the difference between activism and action ultimately is.
I would say that there's huge opportunities for cross-sector collaboration. I think there's a lot of opportunities for government, nonprofits, for-profits, community organizers to be coming together in coalition together to hear each other out. I think a lot of rooms are siloed when it comes to climate solutions. And I think if we were able to bring more stakeholders together that come from different backgrounds, from different sectors, we might be able to find common ground even in those arenas as well, not just by political affiliation, but also implementation of the solutions. We were talking about today that even if we do have a collective vision of the future, how those things get implemented does still lie along, our own political lines or our own theories of change, right? And what needs to happen in the world. And so in order for us to really create dialogue on how to find common ground on those deeper levels requires a lot more conversations of different stakeholders. And so I see that being a really huge opportunity is cross-sector collaboration, also intergenerational conversations, can be really important to also talk about, where are the gaps where young people are showing up, we are showing up through our activism and advocacy, but we don't have the resources or the support necessarily to push our initiatives forward to the extent we want to be. Whereas the older generation does have access to those resources. They do have access to these power structures. So how are they holding themselves accountable to understanding that they have access to that and making sure that they're redistributing that to those of us who are fighting each and every day for our communities?
Right, and Chris, yeah.
There are very few people that are actually convinced by like someone throwing tomato soup at the Mona Lisa or blocking traffic.
Yeah.
That's a tactic that I feel like is on the extremes, and most average Americans look at that and they're like, that does not represent me at all. And it fascinated me even during the conversation today. We had people that were like, yeah, don't put me in that camp. Like,
Yeah.
I care about this issue, but I'm not out there like doing these stunts in museums because, again, like I care about real tangible solutions and policies. And so at the end of the day, we need to be orienting to action, not activism. And so a lot of what ACC does is we have over 40,000 members at over 100 chapters across the country. These are people that are productive members of their community. They'll go clean up the local beach, or they'll help restore an oyster reef. They'll plant trees in the local park, or help a farmer with some regenerative practices on their land. Like, those are things that have tangible benefits for the community, rather than just being angry on social media or doing these stunts that actually, at the end of the day, don't convince anyone. It might actually even make the problem worse politically. So I think there's definitely a huge opportunity for us to reframe around solutions rather than around rhetoric.
Before we wrap, what is one area you each think you can find common ground on within the environmental space?
Well, I'm really passionate about the future of green jobs and the green economy. I think there's a huge opportunity.
Yeah, green. Tell us about that effort.
Yeah, totally. Well, Green Jobs Board came out of my desire as someone who comes from the environmental advocacy background and couldn't find a job when I left school.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I was so passionate about these issues, but was ultimately like, how am I going to get a job to be able to pay my bills after finishing university? And, you know, I realized how difficult it is for so many people to find a job to work on these issues, despite how passionate they are, and to find jobs that pay well and pay decently. And so I started sharing on social media about green jobs and green opportunities. And basically, a lot of people were getting so excited about it to the point where it built enough momentum on social media, especially from Gen Z, that it became a company. And now we are getting engagement from thousands of people, especially young people across the country right now, that are using us as their main go-to resource to find a job to work on climate. And organizations and companies across the country are actively using us as a recruitment resource to bring more diverse talent into climate work as well. A lot of people in this country right now are struggling economically and financially. A lot of people can't put food on the table to feed their kids. And that's a reality. As much as we want people to care about climate change and environmental issues, if people are living in polluted environments and they're not able to pay their bills, they're not going to want to get involved in this space. And so it's really important that those of us that are pushing for these initiatives are creating opportunities for people to get trained, to build jobs, to build long-term career opportunities, and also generate economic wealth and opportunities for their communities. Because ultimately, if we want to create those co-benefits of environmental, economic, and social change that we so desperately are seeking, while also addressing a looming climate crisis, pairing those things together is really important at this time. And I think people across the political spectrum can agree that job creation, the opportunity for an economy that can actually support people and the planet, I think everyone could get behind that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we disagree on things. We might even disagree on a lot of things, but I think that was exactly something that that shows where there is common ground. That at the end of the day, tackling these problems is about offering opportunity and a new vision of the future. And whether there's the conservative way of looking at it is like, we're going to decouple from China and we're going to beat the Chinese Communist Party and we're going to make sure that we have good American manufacturing paying jobs, all those things. Or for you guys, it's talking a little bit more from like the green job perspective or whatever it might be. At the end of the day, if we're talking about like good American jobs that are supporting clean energy and things like that, and these goals that we can all get behind, then I think that's common ground, and we want to go towards that. And there's a reason that Texas is the largest producer of clean energy in the U.S., right? They see clean energy and they don't necessarily think, oh, I'm doing my part to fight climate change. They see clean energy and they're like, dollar signs. Like, that's a good job for my community. I don't have to export my young people anymore because the coal plant nearby is shutting down. And I think if we can just bring communities into the fold and meet them where they're at, that's just something really special. And I might have different language, you might have different language. There might be a ton of other things we disagree with. But if we can agree on that kind of basic principle, that we've reframed this as an opportunity, then I think people can buy into that vision.
Chris and Christy, I think that does it for us. Thank you so much, and thank you for coming together. I think it's something really inspiring. Everyone needs to see. Yeah, thank you. In my next bipartisan segment, I spoke to Isabel Brown, a conservative social media influencer and author of the book, The End of the Alphabet, How Gen Z Can Save America, and Isaias Hernandez, environmental educator and creator of QueerBrownVegan, an independent media platform. He started to bring intersectional environmental education to all. Enjoy the conversation. Okay, Isaias, we'll start with you. Tell us about your moniker, QueerBrownVegan.
Yeah, so my platform is just really rooted in environmental literacy. So it really represents the different intersectional identities, but also the multicultural ways in which society has really evolved. And so part of me was just to recognize that, our identities are very unique to each and every one of them, and really wanted to represent that within the movement space, and recognizing that, we don't just follow one culture. We are really based on diversity of cultures.
Yeah, and talk about how that kind of segues into environmentalism and climate spaces.
Yeah, so I think when it comes to environmental spaces, often at times there is misconceptions and myths that, people of color don't care about the environment, and that, they let themselves live in polluted environments. But I think it's important to recognize history and context. So when we look at, for example, industries in low-income communities of color, or those in rural communities that are white, we often think, well, what came first, the poor community or the toxic industry? And so I think for me, it was really important to address that many communities, specifically those in poverty, often adopt these narratives of yes, I deserve to be in these environments because I didn't work hard in life, did not achieve the American dream. And so I think for many people of color that are in marginalized communities, they really have been subjected to some of the highest level rates of pollution. And I think part of me is to really advocate for marginalized communities to recognize that they are part of this conversation, that they do care about the environment, and that they do want to see a healthy world for everyone.
And Isabel, you often don't hear, conservative or Republican in the same sentence as environmentalism, climate. And I know you spend a lot of time explaining this activism to older conservatives. How do you do that, and how is it being received?
Oh, I love this question because I think it's fascinating to hear that we, for some reason, have arrived at a time where the words conservative and conservationist don't belong in the same sentence, when in reality, the word conserve is right there in the word conservative, and it always has been for a reason. We've bought into this modern lie from society in the last several decades that they are mutually exclusive, and that if you prefer limited government, if you believe in God-given rights, if you want to prioritize freedom of expression or freedom of religion, a lot of these conservative buzz topics that we talk about all day, then that automatically precludes you from participating in any conversation about environmentalism. But I've really gone through a transformative experience in the last several months and years educating myself about the history of conservation in America and around the world because of the work that we do here in the United States. It was President Abraham Lincoln, the first Republican president, that set aside the first public land in the United States with the Yosemite Grant Act. You look at Teddy Roosevelt, who spearheaded the idea of the National Park Service and really was the greatest environmental president of all time, inarguably. Richard Nixon, a Republican, started the EPA. Even the Trump administration that just concluded had some of the most forward-thinking environmental policies of our time with modern presidents. Look at the Great American Outdoors Act and the Trillion Trees Initiative. So really this story and history of conservation baked right into the word conservative has always been there since the beginning of modern conservatism with the founding of the Republican Party. But for whatever reason, we've really lost that story. So it's really exciting to see groups like American Conservation Coalition really facilitating these conversations again, to know that it's not a partisan issue, to believe we all have a responsibility and an obligation to care for our beautiful spaces and to share them with others for generations to come.
And we know that Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has talked quite a bit about conservation, particularly when it comes to the Everglades and some of those areas in Florida. But At the same time, among some of these leading national Republican figures, you don't hear this topic talked about. I mean, why don't you think this is higher on the agenda?
Oh, wow. I mean, if I could answer that question, we'd have a much different political landscape in America today. But I'm really finding that there's so much of a divide in the country that we live in today. We often think that divide exists between left and right more than anything else, but I've come to believe there's far more of a generational divide when it comes to our values than there is partisanly between the left and the right. If you look at issues that young people, young voters from across the political spectrum care about today, they largely center around social issues. Whether you fall on one side or the other with these social issues. We can talk about school safety and gun control. You could talk about the abortion and pro-life conversation happening in America, and obviously the climate and environment as well. For whatever reason, the old guard of the Republican Party, and largely a lot of conservatives that have been in office longer than twice the time that we've been alive, can't really latch on to this idea of social change being upstream from politics. They want to convince you that your wallet is on the ballot with every passing major election in midterms and presidential elections. I think the left has been very effective with our generation by convincing you that your life is on the ballot and that if you don't support all of our policies and every single solution to these social problems that you're dealing with, then you just don't care about them. So I don't know that it's really a lack of concern or care from our elected officials as much as it is a strategic avoidance of these issues under the assumption they're going to lose public support, when in reality, I think it's going to dramatically help conservatives in office if they lean more into these social conversations.
And Isaias, you've talked about, how you're passionate about climate literacy. What does that exactly mean?
Yeah, so climate literacy is a little bit different from environmental literacy, is that climate really focuses on bringing in the topics around racial, social, and environmental justice. And I know that for justice and equity, that is something that is not so much not talked about, but rather misconstrued in different ways or reanalyzed in definitions of political parties. And so I think with climate literacy, the reason why it's so important to really educate that is that today, our generations that we have today we are the social media generation. So 25% of people are learning about climate or environmental related issues through social media, which is then a larger percentage with traditional media, and then you go into TVs and films. So climate literacy is also looking at the fact of how do we talk about greenhouse gases? How do we talk about emissions or pollutions? And so the climate aspect is really understanding the systems itself of our Earth-related sciences, of how they're really congregating and how they're really infecting or influencing the ways that we live as a society, such as the draining of water resources happening here in America from lack of access to clean air. So all of these things are very important to understand, whereas I think environmental literacy kind of also talks generally about the importance of saving the environment and some of the history, and I think with climate literacy allows us to further validate that as an extension of what are the other systems and mechanisms that are happening beyond the health and aspects and social.
Do you two find that language surrounding, whether it's language about climate or the environment, do you think that's a roadblock between liberals and progressives from coming together on this issue? Maybe they don't understand each other. Maybe they don't hear each other. I mean, what do you guys think?
Absolutely. We just had a very productive roundtable conversation about this very topic, that it often feels like we're living in two different Americas today, largely because of our extremely polarized media. Social media obviously plays into that, but I think is helping to break some of those echo chambers by independent voices like us continuing to facilitate dialogue. But really, we're operating with two completely separate vocabularies. If you look at a word like climate, for example, it means two completely different things to a person that you're asking, depending on where they're coming from in the political world today in America. Sadly, everything has become a political connotation, down to the toothbrush that you used this morning or the underwear that you're wearing right now as you watch this video. And I think we get so defensive about defending our definition of that word that it often makes it really difficult for us to let our guards down and just have a productive conversation.
Right.
And I absolutely agree too. I think that, it really depends on the different individuals, how they see it. But collectively, I think that we can agree that caring for life and humanity is a very shared common culture and story for all of society. And I do think that, if we're able to really understand that basis of foundation, I do think that we can come together to say, yes, we can work on this, while we may not always agree politically on the things that we say. And I think that it's normal to disagree as human beings. And I think that's something that we have to remember as we continuously progress into a more destabilized political world that we're entering, of how do we really keep those shambles intact for each other.
And Generation Z has been a huge voice on the environment, talking about how, and climate, talking about how they want to leave this world, better than, they started it with. Talk about Generation Z in the activist community. How are they performing activism? How are they going about this when it comes to environment and climate?
I like to say that we're really reinventing the wheel in a lot of different capacities when it comes to American politics and culture today. I literally just wrote the book on Gen Z that's coming out next month, and it's called The End of the Alphabet, as a nod to kind of the end of life as we know it, because we often hear from both sides of the political spectrum, namely in legacy media, that Gen Z is the end of America. Gen Z is destroying everything that we've known to be good and true and beautiful. But if we look around at the status quo of America today, and we see record anxiety, depression, and suicidation, we see substance abuse, we see lack of care for our communities and the environment that we live in, we see record polarization where we automatically assume someone who disagrees with us on one subject is demonic or evil, and we can't even sit down and have a conversation. Maybe the end of life as we know it isn't so bad. So we're doing that in a ton of different ways. We're kind of rejecting this prescribed pathway to success that I think has been fed to us as a generation. We're not getting 4-year degrees in liberal arts as much as we have been the last several decades, and skipping to entrepreneurship and starting our own activism organizations instead. 62% of our generation has already started their own business, which I find incredibly telling. We're turning off the TV and radio, and we're watching videos on Instagram and TikTok and live streams on YouTube to be educated with honest, real commentary. People aren't trying to hide their bias, but being honest about how they feel about things in the world, and bridging some of those dialogues as well. And in the activism space, the most important thing, I think, is that we're not waiting for permission to lead. We've been told as a generation for far too long that we're too young, we're too inexperienced, we're too naive to actually make a difference in the world of American politics and world geopolitics at large too. So we're supposed to sit down and shut up until we gain enough life experience to get to that point. But we're not waiting, and we're charging ahead, which I think really speaks to the American story of why young voices have always been needed. I ask this question to high schools and colleges a lot when I speak on campus to describe what the founding fathers looked like. And if you flip through our AP US history textbooks or go to any gallery art museum in Washington, D.C., the answer is pretty much always old white men, that they were these sagging, geriatric, completely culturally irrelevant people that had no way of building a society that could stand the test of time. But really, on July 4th, 1776, our founding fathers were 18, 19, 20, 21 years old. Thomas Jefferson was only 33 when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. And so we like to say we're in this revolutionary moment, in a culture war, a 1776 moment, some presidential candidates have been saying, in 2024. And I think a lot of that is being spearheaded by Gen Z, refusing to wait our turn and grasping that American story of youth activism again.
Yeah,
Isaias, absolutely. And I think with, with Gen Z grassroots activists on my end with like leftist movements, I think they're very much involved in like direct action, disinvestment, of boycotting, but also I think respectively, either you're Republican or Democrat, we will vote you out if you're not committed to those policies. And I think it is a very clear indication that more than ever, as this progression of our society continues to get older and more young people every day are eligible to vote, they are no longer communicating to the older generations. They're communicating to us. And so if they're not able to commit to that rhetoric versus the reality, then they are at fear of not losing their jobs, their career, their statuses. So that is important to them and their family and their cultural status that they've built over their years of political advocacy. So it is in our best interest to recognize that if we are not going to recognize these things as an issue, we will find other candidates that are very suitable that will be able to tackle the environment and to say, I may not agree fully with the concept around climate change, but I want to save the earth. I want to save pollution. So let's actually come together. And I think realistically, that's how we're seeing it, is that we can save this democracy. It's just that it needs to be done right and communicated effectively.
And just to wrap up, you hear people say, I maybe lean left or lean right, young people, members of Gen Z, but I don't see Gen Z enthusiastically lining up behind the Democratic platform or the Republican platform. They seem to like this "I don't want to be labeled" approach. From your perspectives, do you see them embracing that approach when it comes to the environmental and climate activist community?
Oh, absolutely. And that speaks volumes with the data as well, that 52% of our generation who are newly registering to vote are choosing to register as independents. 52%, which is completely unheard of from a generational perspective. We're kind of seen as this prize to be won over in American politics, that for so long people and generations at large have pledged their allegiance to one color and one letter at the end of your voter registration, and you'll automatically vote down ticket that way every November. But kind of for the first time ever, we're really embracing individuality and independence in buying into the policies and the individuals that we know are going to follow through on those policies that we really care about. So we're voting with our values first rather than party first. And I hope that creates a conversation about candidate quality, about becoming a United States of America again together rather than being so divided moving forward. And just re-engaging young people in this crazy system experiment that we call America. Most people assume young people just don't care. But if we look at the last several elections, we have record youth voter turnout from every single major election since we've been able to vote.
Right. And Isaias, do you see that in your work?
Yeah, I think with a lot of young voters, like they don't want to be, even myself, it's like I don't like to be said I'm very left wing, because there's certain things that I may be conservative in voting for, certain things that are seen as too radical for others. And so I think it's important to note that independent parties or independent people that are now running, I think the reason why young people are so captivated by them is that they understand their culture, they understand the language, they understand the current issues that they're facing. And I think that with older politicians, they try to really market the same messages that worked for them 40 years ago or 30 years ago. And a lot of the times we love to reference history of like, well, during my time of this, we did this. It's like the year is 2024. We're in a different time. We're in a new policy. New people want different things. There's things that we didn't think 10 years ago would have been passed now. So I think that's something where I feel that the disconnect from democracy, or those that are Republican or Democrats are not understanding, is that if they don't really adopt their new languages, adopt new cultures, adopt new ways to promote and to tell better stories, then they are really at fear of losing this. And I think that's where independence, in my view, has given some liberation or some type of autonomy to people to really express themselves or feel more connected to those individuals.
Absolutely. Well, and thanks again to Isabel and Isaias. Now, a bit more from former Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger at the roundtable.
So that's the interesting thing about it, because that's why I don't like to use the word climate change that much, even though we are in the middle of climate change, and it will have devastating effects as we go down, year after year and not do anything about it. But to me, what is more dangerous right now is pollution. Because if we can get rid of pollution, then we don't have to worry about climate change. So pollution is really the evil.
My next two guests are Joe Pinion, CEO of Pinion Media Group, and a clean energy strategist who is a one-time GOP U.S. Senate candidate, and Nalleli Cobo, a 22-year-old progressive environmental activist who is the youngest female to receive the Goldman Environmental Prize. Take a listen. Okay, Nalleli, I'll start with you. You've spoken about how you suffered health consequences of growing up so close to oil fields in the Los Angeles area. Talk to us about that.
I grew up 30 feet from an active oil and gas well that severely impacted my health. From nosebleeds to asthma to cancer, I've had it all. It started when I was 9 years old. I was just like any other normal girl. I loved dancing and music and Justin Bieber, and my childhood was being limited by my toxic next door neighbor. When living next to an active oil and gas well, you can't open your windows in fear of letting more emissions come inside of your house. You can't go outside and play with your friends because going outside can trigger an asthma attack. That was my childhood, and at the age of 19, that shadow casted over my future when I was diagnosed with stage 2 reproductive cancer at the age of 19, and I was forced to choose between my reproductive system and my life. And I'm here, but I fight so that story ends with me.
Right. So your health issues have led you into this field of environmentalism.
Yes, I never decided to wake up one day and become an activist. My activism really was born out of survival, and it was fighting to open my window in my home. And shortly thereafter, I realized that there are more communities like mine, and I've just never stopped fighting.
Right. And Joe, you oftentimes don't hear Republican and conservative and the environment. Talk about your experience in this field of activism and politics and talking about these issues.
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, I often remark about the time I went to listen to former Congressman Chris Gibson, who sat down and said, if conservation is not conservative, then words have no meaning at all. And I think that was a really powerful statement to me. And listening to people from my own community, living in New York, living in this country, understanding concretely that we need to have renewable energy if we're going to actually compete on a global scale, understanding that communities from Mount Vernon in New York to Jackson in Mississippi to Flint are all dealing with what I call just compound despair when you deal with the actual neglect to our community infrastructure from either water or just general lack of attention to the issues of climate and to the issues of our environment. So I think there is a compelling case to be made, irrespective of one's politics, that we have to take these issues seriously, that if we're going to compete with the Chinas of the world, that we have to be leading in renewable energy, that we have to actually recognize also this is a global problem where the majority of the emissions we're trying to curb are coming from around the globe and not here in the United States of America.
Nalleli spoke about her experience growing up in the Los Angeles area. What are, some of the environmental, risks and problems that New Yorkers are facing?
Well, look, I mean, you can go straight to public housing in New York City that's $80 billion behind on critical repairs. We know for a fact that there's lead in the drinking water, arsenic in the drinking water. We also know for a fact that if you expand beyond New York, we've got close to 50,000 water filtration units, plants across the country that are in many ways been derelict in our responsibility to maintain those and upgrade those, particularly for smaller communities. So everywhere you want to look, the neglect to our infrastructure is real. It has impacted people across the spectrum. And even if you look at New York as a live case study for what happens when some of these policies get put in place, we shut down Indian Point in the interest of trying to get rid of what they called antiquated nuclear energy infrastructure. You look at now the actual emissions have gone up close to 30% in the area. Our ability to provide cost-effective energy to the surrounding tri-state area has been compromised. And even if you blast your eyes upstate for something that we're hoping will bring jobs to New York State, the advancement of the Micron actual chip manufacturing plant, that plant requires the actual monthly input of close to 1 million homes. And we do not actually have the energy capacity to provide for that energy need. So any way you want to slice it, from a business standpoint to a government standpoint to just a personal everyday living and dying standpoint, we need smarter solutions on climate change. We need smarter solutions on the environment. We need better solutions when it comes to renewable energy.
Nalleli, activism for you, or your experience in activism, started when you were 9 years old, and you're the youngest female recipient of the Goldman Environmental Prize. It's an award given to grassroots environmental champions from around the world. Talk about what your activism looks like and how it's evolved as you've gotten older.
Something I've always said is I don't know all the science or legal terms when it comes to this. I know my story. I know how my body has been affected, how my community has been affected, and I believe storytelling is a very compelling form of activism that goes unnoticed. So I am a storyteller. I use my story anywhere I can to share what communities like mine, a community and historically viewed as invisible, as disposable, as silenced, in South Los Angeles, that successfully shut down a toxic oil drilling site in their community. That's so powerful, and sharing that story across the world in different platforms, in different spaces where we are allowed to challenge systems, where we're allowed to hold each other up and to make noise when it comes to addressing environmental racism, when it comes to addressing the urban oil extraction issues that we're facing. And my activism changes every day, but for me it's very heavily based on storytelling.
Joe, speaking of storytelling, as you know, running a campaign and running for office is telling a story. It's storytelling in its own way. When you ran for Senate, were you able to talk about this issue, around New York State?
Certainly, I think we talked about the reality of the policy. What's the objective, right? If we're saying that we want more nuclear energy, why do we want that, right? If we're saying that we are committed to reducing carbon emissions, then why are we doing so, right? So I think trying to connect the actual policy to the everyday pain points of the people is something I think we're able to do effectively. Again, talking about the cost of those electricity bills, the fact that after decades of people talking about the need to reduce our emissions, we now have, in many ways, taken the energy production of New York and gone in the wrong direction, leading to more carbon emissions. So it's not just being able to go out there with what I call the sloganeering, right? That things that are a mile wide and an inch deep. What is the substance behind the rhetoric that actually allows us to hit those actual climate objectives that we're listing?
New York is certainly a blue state, but Republicans have made inroads in the state. Do you find that, working with Democrats and talking to Democrats in New York, that there's maybe some common ground on this issue? Maybe you don't agree with everything, but do you find that maybe there's some room for bipartisan working together?
I think that if you're talking about people's economic needs and the economic despair that exists in New York, there's certainly a lot of fertile ground, right? I'm from Yonkers, New York. We had a once thriving energy plant on the Hudson River that has now gone through many different iterations and is now effectively a museum. And so there is and should be the opportunity to talk about hydroelectricity as a driver for jobs in a building that once was a driver for just jobs and power for that actual community. We're not necessarily having those conversations. So I think we as Republicans can do a better job of connecting people's everyday experience to the policies we're advocating for and saying, no, we're not advocating for nuclear because we're reckless. We're advocating for nuclear because if you're serious about reducing emissions and you're serious about putting people to work, it is the easiest way for us to hit all the needs for all the people. And if you're talking about natural gas, there's plenty of skepticism and rightful concern about the potential adverse impact there. But at the end of the day, if you're comparing the natural gas that we have here in the United States of America versus the natural gas you get from places like Russia that are dirtier, that do not care about the actual emissions that they are putting into the environment, we are better off with American natural gas than we are with Russian natural gas, even while acknowledging that there are still precautions that we should be put in place to protect the health of individuals like yourself and people's communities that have really been, decimated by bad actors at the corporate level. So I think those are the real things. Yes, there are best case scenarios that we're all trying to pursue, but even with things like chip manufacturing around the globe, is it right to have black children in Africa digging with their bare hands for those rare earth minerals when we can do it safer and more effective here at home and also have more autonomy and more actual sovereignty here at home? So these are really complex conversations that require really nuanced solutions, but I think we have the capacity to do that when we engage in good faith, and I think that's what today was really about, getting people across the political spectrum to come to the table with serious solutions to confront a serious issue.
And Nalleli, I understand you'll be taking part in an event with former Governor Schwarzenegger and Governor Gavin Newsom, a Republican and a Democrat, on some legislation. If you could tell us about that.
So 2 years ago, the Governor of California, Gavin Newsom, signed and implemented into law SB 1137, which is a 3,200-foot health and safety buffer zone between new oil extraction and sensitive land, places where people live, work, play, and pray, etc. And days later, the oil industry spent $20 million on a referendum to keep this off of the ballots, keep this off the law and in the ballots for this November of 2024, and they're willing to spend up to $200 million on this referendum. It's a very big fight. We're saying it's all hands on deck because this is such a real issue that can save the lives and prioritize the health and well-being of 2.7 million Californians that live a mile or less to an active oil and gas well. In the United States, we have 18 million Americans living a mile or less to an active oil and gas well. And this referendum and this vote is taking our policies back. It's taking our communities and our lives back and showing the oil industry that they have no place in our backyards, that they have no place in our policies and our democracy, because at the end of the day, it should always be people over profit. And that isn't the way this has been working, unfortunately. And we're going to vote and we're going to keep SB 1137 into law, and we're taking back our lives, and we're ensuring that we're giving our children and our future generations a world where they look outside of their windows and they see trees and not oil rigs.
One common theme I've heard, throughout these conversations is talking about language and how language is so important from one side to reach the other. It seems like both of you have brought up health, obviously. Do you think talking about the effects of the environment on someone's health and well-being is the key to getting something done here between Republicans, Democrats, liberals, and conservatives?
Yeah, look, I think personally, health is a huge component of it. I think anytime you can take policies that people don't fully understand and put them in the context of their everyday existence, you're moving the ball forward. And so, sure, I think, yeah, you can talk about the fact that even from a basic human decency standpoint, right? You've got people spending close to 30% of their disposable income on laundry, right? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? No, it's a terrible thing, right? People having to spend so much money on basic needs, but that is an infrastructure issue. That is an environmental issue. The amount of water that we use, are the machines actually energy efficient? You talk about the drinking water. Is it clean? Is it palatable, right? These issues didn't happen overnight. There is generations of compound neglect that have happened all across this country, a nation where most of the sewage actual infrastructure that we have was built before we had indoor plumbing, right? So if you understand that context, then it's easier to communicate to people why the paper-thin walls in public housing matter, as a matter of them not getting the type of environmental justice they deserve. They might not think of the fact that they're cold in their home as an environmental justice issue, but you can reframe it as such when you explain to people that the majority of the actual funding for public housing in New York City comes from the federal government, that the federal government has decided, either intentionally or unintentionally, that their needs, their safety, their security does not matter. And so we end up in this kind of bipartisan situation where I feel like the needs of neglected communities either get ignored or weaponized for the purposes of winning elections. But those issues never actually really get tapped into. And so that is, I think, to your point, right, we can have a conversation about, can you trust the water coming out of your faucet? Because chances are you really can't. Can you actually trust the water that comes out of the faucet when you take a shower? Chances are you cannot. Can you trust the fact that the actual electricity coming out of the wall is not magic, but it's a consortium of all the energy capacity that we have here in this state? And is that capacity going to be able to power this state next year and the year beyond that? Currently, as it currently stands, it will not.
And Nalleli, do you think talking about health is the key to getting something done on this issue?
I think it's an extremely important thing to highlight, especially as a cancer survivor. It's not something you just walk away from. That's something that I had to learn the hard way. I thought when I rang the bell and finished my cancer treatments that I would just bounce back to the way I was before, and that's not the reality. The reality is now I'm disabled, I'm chronically ill for life, and I have so many other issues that I'm now having to navigate this new quality of life I have. But talking about the health and safety issues is what humanizes the issue. It's what takes it from being, again, this map with a bunch of dots on where the active oil and gas wells are. It takes these really heavy scientific data with chemicals names that half of ordinary people like myself, we can't even pronounce adequately. And storytelling again, and taking it back to where you can humanize the issue and you can share your personal impact, you can share the real day-to-day life that frontline communities go through. It makes it as you can't walk away from the issue because you yourself have had a nosebleed. So you can't imagine having one so intense where you can't sleep in your own bed at night. My grandma was diagnosed with asthma at the age of 70, and she had to learn how to use an inhaler in a second language. She's now going through cancer treatments, and it's so many different disparities that are the reality for so many communities, regardless of whether we're in California or New York. Those are real things that so many of us, we can put hand in hand and the symptoms align. And talking about just that, because someone had mentioned, this isn't just an environmental crisis, this is a human crisis. 1 in 5 deaths worldwide is due to fossil fuel pollution currently. And what are we doing to change that? We shouldn't wait for the number to get 4 out of 5 or 3 out of 5. We need to start doing something now, because we shouldn't wait until it's your life on the line. We need to start finding ways to change the policies to prevent lives from being on the line.
Next, we'll hear from Jeff Luse, a policy analyst and deputy editor at C3 Solutions, which focuses on clean energy policy solutions that work, and Sierra Quitiquit, a professional skier, climate activist, and CEO of Time for Better, a climate communications agency. Let's take a look. So Sierra, to start with you, you grew up in Park City, Utah, big skier, so snow is a huge part of your life, but you at the same time got sort of a front row seat to seeing the climate change. Talk about how that experience has impacted your activism.
Yeah, my community has been really affected by the loss of snowpack. You know, for example, as a child, we had the World Cup, which brought millions of dollars to my community, and we lost the snow, and that event moved to Europe. And so we've seen a huge economic decline in my hometown of Park City, and that inspired me to reach out to my audience and any audience I could reach and speak about the world that's changing.
And who is your audience?
My background was as a professional skier. That was how my platform was built, and so I think sports enthusiasts. But those are people that care about the natural world and want to preserve our wonderful natural world. So I think those folks are inherently interested in leaning in on making the world a better place.
And Jeff, oftentimes you don't hear, the words Republican and conservative in the same sentence as environmentalism or climate change. Talk about your background in getting involved in this space as a conservative.
Yeah. Well, I think it started growing up in PA. It's very like oil and gas, obviously, so that employed my family. So I never quite viewed the natural gas industry as evil. They were employers, so it helped my community a lot. But then, as I started getting older, the news coverage started shifting a bit more on climate change, and obviously, when you're young, that's pretty alarming. It gets you involved. But then I kind of saw the solutions that were getting promoted primarily from like progressive and left of center, and I didn't quite agree with them. So to me, it was just kind of like a bit of a no-brainer. Like, I kind of viewed the world as needing to be cared for, but I also thought that my worldview and the issue sets that I believed in could do that. And as it turns out, that's true. We've seen that with energy policy in the U.S. We've seen the free market at work, being able to, with natural gas, displace coal, and that led the U.S. to kind of lead the world in emissions reductions. So I think history and economics kind of shows us that free market, right of center solutions work to take care of the environment, and they also have economic co-benefits. So it's kind of a win-win.
And Sierra, what are you looking to get accomplished? What does the end game look like for you? Does it have to do with obviously lowering pollution, or is there what are some initiatives that you'd like to see implemented?
I think everyone should care about the environmental movement, and I think we all have a stake in this game right now. We're amidst a health crisis, actually. Infertility, mental health, endocrine disruption. All of these issues can be linked back to plastics and the fossil fuel industry and pollution. And so I think that my goal as a climate communicator is to getting more community in that movable middle out to act and vote on climate, because this is the decisive decade, and the most critical point right now is this is the decisive decade and the most critical point to act, and we all have a stake in this game if we want to create a better future for ourselves, our economy, and our children.
Jeff, you recently wrote a post in National Review talking about President Biden's initiatives to get more Americans or young Americans to plant more trees, and you said that's great, but it's not necessarily the root of the problem. We should be doing other things. What else should the Biden administration and Republican and Democratic officials and lawmakers be doing in that space?
Yeah, I think it all starts with with climate policy. The solutions can't be worse than, with climate change, I should say, the solutions can't be worse than the problem. So I think that should be kind of top of mind for policymakers in the administration and on the Hill. they should be prioritizing solutions that grow the economy but also reduce emissions. So, for instance, you could look at permitting reform. It takes more than 4.5 years for any energy project to get built in this country. With energy demand set to grow, like we need more energy, we're going to need more clean energy specifically, and more reliable energy. So like that's an obvious one. Nuclear energy, it's our safest and it's our cleanest source of power. And to their credit, the Biden administration has prioritized that. Republicans have as well, through funding for the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program. Then there's the ADVANCE Act. So Congress has, and so has the Biden administration. They've been kind of pushing a few of these issues, but it really should focus, instead of a federal jobs program with the Climate Corps, we should be working on ways to unleash the private sector and unleash the market to address this problem, which would reap economic and environmental co-benefits.
So Sierra, you talked about health as being a major driving factor for people to care about climate and the environment. Jeff, you talked about the economic impact, jobs, the market, et cetera. Do you think that's the language that's needed to get people on both sides of the aisle to come together and say, okay, we want the same things ultimately, but we just might be going about it in a different way? Do you think it's the language that's really the roadblock here?
Yeah, I think we're living in a world that's really decisive, and there's a lot of fear, which drives hatred, and that's really unfortunate because actually we do all want the same thing. We want to breathe clean air. We want to drink clean water. We want to be able to power our homes affordably. And I think it was really nice to sit around the table today and all talk about solutions and agree on solutions. And I agree with so many things that you said. I think nuclear energy is a viable, clean energy solution. And I think that we need to bring a collaborative approach because climate change proposes the largest problem humanity's ever faced. And we need radical collaboration to make that happen and less finger pointing across the aisle.
Yeah, I think incorporating the language, and I think just more bipartisan roundtables like we just had. I learned a lot, and I hope some of my friends on maybe the left learned a lot. But yeah, I think we want a lot of the same things. There's definitely going to have to be some give and take. I think that people maybe just need to accept that. But we can ultimately get to what we want, which is a cleaner environment, a more robust economy. Yeah.
Do you guys think the future of climate and environmental activism, whether it's on the left or the right, lies with Gen Z? I mean, this seems to be a group of young people who don't necessarily put as much onus on a political label. So maybe that means there's more opportunity for them to work together.
I mean, Gen Z isn't holding political office right now, so we can, create the rally cry and put leverage on our politicians, but the responsibility lies in those in office to create action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think activism is great. I think grassroots activism is great, but I think our generation also needs to kind of point to the economic co-benefits of the solutions that we want. As Sierra said, none of us are really holding office, and in order to communicate to the policymakers and lawmakers, we have to show that what we want isn't going to wreck our economic status and our economic strength. So I think it is a good blend of we need a lot of grassroots activism, but we also need grass tops policy and economic analysis and things of that nature. And I think I'm hopeful that our generation can do that. I really am.
Yeah, and finally, how do you communicate with those policymakers that are older than Gen Z? I mean, I understand that's a pretty wide-ranging question, but how do you reach them?
Yeah, it's kind of what I said before. There's certainly a political pressure telling these lawmakers that the younger generations care about it, but it's also kind of showing that, especially with right of center conservative lawmakers, that addressing climate change or engaging in the issue isn't an automatic bend to Al Gore. It's not saying we don't love capitalism. So I think for us, it's been showing the economic and environmental co-benefits of good climate policy. We've done a report called Free Economies or Clean Economies. In that report, we show that free economies are twice as clean as unfree economies. So I think that's hugely important that we can have environmental progress, but environmental progress goes hand in hand with economic progress as well. So a lot of the solutions that we want, nuclear energy, permitting reform, green energy even, like those provide jobs, it helps maintain energy security. It also gives American leadership in the world, which I think is something that, lawmakers on Capitol Hill really, really value.
I think it's easy in this day and age to say my actions, my vote, my opinion doesn't matter, and that's a really dangerous place to sit. And so I would encourage all young people out there to get involved and to realize that they have a really important voice and a stake in the claim in the future of our world. And so picking up the phone and dialing your representatives, sending emails, voting, getting smart about what's on the ballot, this is all really, really critical. And if you're deciding to sit that out and be a passerby, then you're forfeiting your stake in the future. And so I think it's really important that we all lean in this moment and we all help co-create and collaborate in the world that we want to live in.
Excellent. Well, Sierra and Jeff, I think that does it for us. Thank you so much for
much.
taking part in this. I appreciate it. Thanks again to Jeff and Sierra. Now back over to former Governor Schwarzenegger for some final thoughts.
I know that the Democrats would love to up the renewable energy in America. Their wish is to increase it by 100%. So to go from 20% to 40%. Well, the Republicans would love nothing more than to have nuclear power. Well, we also know that that's the cleanest form of energy. So there's a renewable energy that's the clean form of energy. There's nuclear power that's the clean form of energy.
My final guests are Isaac Michael Ybarra, a progressive climate activist and artist, and Chris Johnson, the managing director of Young Conservatives for Carbon Dividends, which aims to mobilize young conservative leaders to renew the GOP's legacy of environmental leadership and lay the groundwork for a free market climate breakthrough. Have a listen. So just to start off with, this is a unique event in that you have progressives and conservatives coming together to talk about the environment. I would love to get both of your takes on how it's been and, what you see for this bipartisan relationship going forward.
Yeah, I feel like I learned a lot. There was some clear vocabulary differences, some ways that we talk about this stuff, different priorities, all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, it was really great to kind of see folks get pragmatic really quickly once we got past those barriers and realized that the enemy that we perceived is not our actual enemy. And honestly, a lot of it was just like, hey, we're friendly people. We're having a good time. And yeah, it was really encouraging.
Yeah, Isaac.
I think I can reiterate that it was great to meet up with people who are, neighbors and not opponents. And it was easier to have a discussion amongst each other.
Yeah. And do you see that as hopeful for younger millennials and Generation Z going forward? I mean, looking at this, it was sort of emblematic of maybe the future of politics and activism in a way.
Yeah. I would love to be more optimistic.
Yeah.
I think spaces like this are really unique. I think they're very productive. I think there's a lot of good conversations that kind of happen, but our culture broadly is so deeply polarized, and the state of our politics is not going to change anytime soon, just because we have a couple of these moments. Now, if we make a culture of that, great, but that's, I think, going to take a lot of time. So I think what we should do is take our lessons learned from this, go back into our corners with our own, groups of folks that care about this, that are on our team, and figure out the best ways to message to them that's going to lead to, once we all have to come back together to make public policy, that we're all on the same page.
Right.
I'd say my take on that is completely different. I'm excited, and I feel like the square has been rounded, where the corners are kind of gone, and we've got a circle going. So I think it's easier to navigate between each other.
Right. And I want to get into what you each do individually in your areas of activism. Isaac, you're focused on telling stories of Indigenous people, and particularly in this area. Before the interview, we were talking about your ancestors and growing up in the LA area. Is that what really got you into environmentalism and this realm?
That is a tough question. I would say, you can't jump into something that you're already a part of. And so being surrounded by nature and learning so much about nature from the people you love and hold dear to you, encourages you to go back and preserve those spaces so that you can teach your young ones.
Right.
I tell stories not just of indigenous people, but the indigenous land, you know, and creating more space for our cultural stories to remain prevalent and relevant.
Do you think environmentalism and activism for indigenous communities sort of go hand in hand?
Yeah, of course. I think I read a stat somewhere that almost 80% of environmental advocacy is sort of spearheaded by indigenous communities around the globe. So.
Right. And Chris, you oftentimes don't hear Republican and conservative and environmentalism. A lot of it's the language that's, you know, involved and such, but I wanted to get your take. How did you get into this realm?
Yeah, as annoying as it is, I really don't love the term environmentalist. I don't use it for myself, even though it's kind of similar for goals, because ultimately when as conservatives we're looking at the climate problem, yes, it's an environmental problem, but it's an energy problem, it's an economic problem, it's a trade problem. So I got started working in Republican politics in Ohio during the fracking boom. And I know in environmental circles, fracking is a dirty word, but I ultimately got to see a way in which we saw emissions go down in Ohio due to market-driven conservative policies, and it created this set of permission structures for conservatives to talk about, yeah, reducing emissions, this is good, this is how we do things, this is a conservative conservation effort, bringing back the rhetoric of Reagan and Nixon and so many Republicans, you know, Governor Schwarzenegger, you know, before them, creating the kind of muscle memory that allowed them now in 2024 to start advocating for some really robust climate policies, boosting nuclear, advocating for permitting reform, holding China accountable for their pollution on the global stage. All of those things got started because of stuff like people like me seeing fracking a technology reduce emissions and make me go, yeah, we should be bragging about this. As Americans, we should get excited about this. As conservatives, we should get excited about this.
And you hear Ulysses Grant, Teddy Roosevelt, Reagan, Nixon, Schwarzenegger, all of these Republican figures. What are some Republican figures today in 2024, in your view, that are sort of leading the charge on this issue?
Yeah, I think the answer you're usually going to get is the more moderate folks, and so I'm sure they're going to get plenty of praise, and deservedly so. You know, if you're somebody like a Mitt Romney or whatever, who's taken on this issue seriously. But there's a lot of folks on the more you know, MAGA, America First right, who are taking on this issue as well. They're just talking about it in a totally different way. And so you see folks like Governor DeSantis talking about resilience and taking on emissions abroad, reducing emissions at home, doing the kind of building that we're going to need for a 21st century economy in a changing climate. All those kind of things are often not talked about as climate things because he doesn't talk about them as climate things. But for those of us that are on the eco-right, we kind of get the joke, and we kind of see what he's doing, and we're thankful that there's leaders like him, especially younger leaders like him, who are setting the tone for the next generation of conservatives.
So one common theme I've observed today is language, and it seems like maybe there's a language barrier between those, you know, maybe on the left-leaning side of this issue and those on the right. And, you know, some talking to conservatives, it seems like maybe it's a generational barrier as well. Talk about that barrier of language. I mean, Governor Schwarzenegger talked about how he doesn't like when it's described as climate or climate change. Do you see that in your day-to-day work in this field? Isaac, we'll go first.
I'd say, of course. I think the biggest thing that I took away from today is, you know, there's pollution on Tongva land, and pollution is no good. So let's start there, and let's hold each other accountable, and, you know, take a stand against that.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things we've seen when we're talking to right of center audiences is exactly what Governor Schwarzenegger was talking about. If you go in there and you talk about carbon and climate and all these kind of things, like, we on the eco right acknowledge those are serious problems we need to address, but framing it for our audiences on the right as pollution, as a global problem, focusing on China since they're, you know, 3 times as dirty as our production is, all those kind of things, again, to create the right set of permission structures to support policies that do reduce emissions, that do address the climate issue, even if we're not making it a climate thing. And so I was so encouraged to hear Governor Schwarzenegger seeing those kinds of responses. We've seen polling that shows if you ask about, hey, should we, you know, address, you know, carbon pollution from China, you'd get 60-70% support. If you but if you drop the carbon or you don't make it a climate thing, you're getting 85-90% support among Trump supporting Republicans. And obviously reducing emissions in China is a step towards reducing emissions globally in the way that we need to.
Right. And we see a lot of activism in the, environmental space, conservation space. You see a lot of, protests. And one, I was chatting with Christy and Chris about this earlier. You often see the images of the throwing red paint on, in museums in Europe and such. And they're climate change or environmental protesters. They're bringing attention in that way. But at the same time, there seems to be this common thread of, okay, but we're not getting results. What do you both think is the biggest barrier right now facing people who want to make a difference in this space?
I'll let you go ahead.
I think politics is such a dirty word. We heard from Isabel earlier talking about how like 50-some% of Gen Z identifies as an independent. And so there's a lot of folks who are really not interested in the political process, think it's messy, think it's selling out, think it's embracing neoliberalism or neoconservatism, whatever boogeyman your side decides is the problem. And the reality is that doesn't stop the desire to do something. That doesn't stop the desire for activism. And so it ends up in these moments of lash out where you're throwing paint or you're blocking traffic or whatever, where if that were funneled towards actually getting involved in the political process, working in primary elections to get folks elected who are good on this issue, and ultimately maybe working for a member of Congress on the Hill, drafting legislation that does that stuff. I know that's a harder lift for a lot of folks, but it's so much more effective. And if we get away from politics as a dirty word and we understand that politics is necessary to getting things done, you'll see that shift, that pressure valve go towards something a lot more productive.
Right.
I'd say the biggest barrier facing activists face is propaganda, because throwing paint on a glass protective case against a painting or stopping traffic is another form of freedom of speech, and it forces people who aren't paying attention to pay attention and question motives.
Right. And do you feel that the news media and maybe the media at large, opinion media as well, what role do you think that's playing in this? Because it seems like, and I'm kind of getting the sense from your answer, it's painted maybe a picture that isn't necessarily the way you see it. Do you think the news media is tainted?
Of course.
Yeah. Tainted this issue?
I work with cameras. I'm a filmmaker, and we paint the picture. But that's the great thing about freedom of speech is, and this opportunity here, we have we have a group of people who are on the opposite side of the aisle, just communicating and speaking to each other, like I said, as neighbors. So the media is tainted, but I wouldn't say it's the enemy either. Right.
And do you feel that the media is tainting this issue?
Yeah, I feel like this is a tough one when talking to the media.
Seriously.
Seriously. I do think, there's an entertainment value add to creating a world in which there's two enemies of each other that are fighting against one another for issues that are of real importance, and so it raises the temperature in the room so much. And so when you're able to have an issue of such salience like climate, and then you're able to paint it as you're either with these guys who are crazy and think that climate change is fake and it's all made up by communists to ruin America, or you have the folks that are the world is ending tomorrow, both of those create a sense of not just enmity between people, but also a sense of like, well, what am I supposed to do?
Yeah.
Is there anything that can be done? It creates what folks our age refer to as like doomerism, where you're like, well, nothing matters anyways. It's a nihilistic view of the world. That's the kind of stuff that media environment creates, unfortunately. And look, I'm on cable news regularly. I'm part of the problem. I'm trying to make the discourse better, but it's a real issue that there's ultimately a market for that kind of media.
Yeah, so I feel like we just went to maybe a darker place there. Sorry. I want to end on a more positive note. What is one area where you think both sides of the political spectrum can come together on the environment? Isaac, you first.
The biggest thing that I hope everyone takes away is get to know your local tribes, because those are your allies and they have a lot of knowledge with solutions that we're looking for.
Right.
I think there's a sense that as we get further down the line here and the climate problem is not solved and our environment continues to be degraded by various forms of pollution, there is a sense that everybody is coming to the realization that there are trade-offs in public policy making, and people are becoming more and more comfortable with talking about those trade-offs and talking about them with their own team and acknowledging, hey, there's this thing that we're going to do. It's not perfect. We're going to have to make some deals. We're going to have to concede a little bit to the other side, but it's necessary, and the longer we wait on doing this, the worse it's going to get. And so I think I was really encouraged, even in moments of tension in the conversation today, that we ultimately got to the point where, like, yeah, we're all going to have to sacrifice something here, and that's okay, because we're going to move closer to solving the problem.
Tell us about how you're using film and artwork to tell this story and to pursue activism.
We have the ability to influence each other through creative practices, and sometimes that influence can be called propaganda. So we need anti-propaganda, and I believe encouraging all of us to reflect and remember that it's not just about us and the humans. We're also connected to habitat and nature. We're not separated from that. So through a lot of my films, I do my best to show nature's perspective.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much to you both. Yeah, we appreciate it. And that brings us to the end of our program. A big thank you to all of our guests and to all of you for watching. For those of you who missed any of the conversations this afternoon, the full event is available on our website, thehill.com. I'm Julia Manchester. I hope you enjoyed the program and have a great rest of your day.